the young, and the restless spoilers. When Dominic finally stirred, the stillness in the room broke in a way that made Mariah's heart clench rather than breathe in relief. Because the first conscious thing the little boy did was not reach for her, not cling to her, not seek reassurance from the woman who had risked everything to bring him here, but to fix his unfocused eyes on the ceiling and whisper the name of the one person whose absence had defined everything, his father. It was the repetition that hollowed her out. Even without words, she could feel how often that name lived in his small chest, how many times he had fallen asleep clutching it like a talisman. How many nights in the Chancellor Mansion he had been soothed with stories about a brave father who chased bad people and protected those he loved. Dominic didn't remember all of the details of the chaos that had led to this moment, but his body remembered safety, and in his mind that safety had a face, a scent, a steady heartbeat. And it belonged to Chance. Mariah watched his lips form the syllables again and again, watched the confusion gather when the room that met his eyes was not the familiar nursery but a strange, dim hideout that smelled like dust and desperation, watched the flicker of fear ignite when he did not see the man he was calling for. She felt terror not only because the boy's distress cut into her, but because every time he reached for the absent father, it was as if the thin veil of justification she had wrapped around herself began to tear. She had told herself that what she was doing was about protecting Dominic from a world that had not learned how to cherish him the way she did. That Ian's poison about Abby and Devon had merely crystallized a truth she already felt. That Dominic had been treated like an accessory, a symbol, a trophy in adult battles. But faced with a child who did not cling to her, who did not relax against the arms that had carried him into hiding, who instead called out in a trembling voice for the father he believed would fix everything, Mariah felt the full weight of what she had done press down on her chest. Ian Ward, sitting across the room with his wrists now bound after their earlier clash, still had the smug satisfaction of a man who believed the world would eventually bend to his vision. He was the architect of the narrative that cast Mariah as a savior rather than a kidnapper, the one who had whispered that the courts, the wealthy families, the institutions would never truly see her as a mother, only as a surrogate who should stay in her place. He had taken her old scars, years of feeling unwanted, past her own, discarded and sharpened them into weapons she turned against the Chancellors. But even Ian couldn't silence the truth that came out of Dominic's mouth now. Each time the boy tried to say his father's name, Mariah heard a verdict being read out in a courtroom that did not exist yet, a judgment not from a judge or a jury, but from the very child she had sworn to protect. Fear curled cold and tight in her stomach, because if Chance ever found out about this, if he knew that his son had been dragged into a nightmare in which he clung to memories of his father as the only light, there would be no mercy left in him for Ian or for her. Far from the claustrophobic room where Dominic trembled and Mariah's guilt metastasized, Chance's world had narrowed around one single horrifying fact: his son had been taken. The moment the message reached him, fragmented, frantic, layered with details about a missing child and a trail that led to someone he had trusted more than most, something inside him that had painstakingly healed after his long disappearance cracked open. Again? For months, he had been the shadow on the edge of Genoa City's story, alive when others had mourned him, watching from a distance as Abby learned to breathe without him, as the life that should have been his fractured and reassembled into something he no longer recognized. Duty had dragged him away before. This time, duty pulled him back. The badge he wore was more than metal and authority. It was a vow, and no vow he had ever made was louder than the one he had silently taken when he first held Dominic in his arms. Hearing that Dominic had vanished, hearing the name Ian Ward tangled in the reports, ignited a rage that didn't burn hot and wild but cold and surgical. This was not just a crime, not just another case in a career full of ugly human choices. This was an invasion into the most sacred part of his life. The thought that his son might wake up in a strange place, afraid and alone, thinking he had been abandoned again, was a knife that twisted with every breath. Beneath the fury, however, there was another feeling Chance could not easily admit, even to himself: guilt. He had chosen missions and danger and disappearance. He had made choices that had left Abby to raise Dominic without him, that had forced others to step into roles he had vacated. Some small, Ugly part of him wondered if this was the universe turning the knife back on him, if this was his punishment for all the times he had not been there when his family needed him. But unlike his past ghosts, this one could still be saved. That knowledge became his compass. His training, his instincts, and the quiet network of contacts he still maintained from his time away began to close in around Ian's trail. Each step toward the truth stripped another layer of distance from his heart. Dominic stopped being a photograph tucked in his wallet or a memory Abby carefully curated from milestones he had missed, and became a very real child in danger. With a heartbeat Chance could practically hear echoing in his ears. When Chance finally tracked them to the rundown property on the edge of town, every sense sharpened. The building was forgettable by design, one of those places no one noticed even if they drove past it every day, and that invisibility made his skin crawl. As he moved through the hallway, gun drawn, breath steady in the way only a trained officer could manage under such pressure, his mind split into two layers. The professional reading of each detail, the scuff marks on the floor, the faint sound of movement behind closed doors, the smell of stale air, and the personal roar that repeated only two words over and over, "My son." He found Ian first. The older man's arrogance had faltered the moment he realized that the law had finally caught up. But there was still a glint in his eye that spoke of delusion and ego, as if he truly believed that even now he controlled the story. The struggle between them had been brief and brutal. Chance did not take pleasure in the violence, he took necessity. When the handcuffs snapped shut around Ian's wrists and the man's taunts were reduced to muffled grunts, Chance felt one small piece of the chaos fall into place. But it wasn't until he pushed open the next door that time stopped. There, on a thin mattress in the corner, sat Dominic, knees pulled up, small hands curled around the edge of a blanket too scratchy for a child who should have been swaddled in warmth. His face was pale from fear and confusion, his hair mussed from restless sleep, and in his eyes lived the raw question the world had failed to answer for him too many times: "Where is my father?" The moment the door creaked, Dominic flinched, but then his gaze locked onto the silhouette in the doorway. Recognition didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, the shape of the shoulders he had seen in photos, the angle of the jawline that matched pictures on the mantel, the faint trace of a voice he had heard in old recordings Abby played when the house grew too quiet. Chance felt the edges of his vision blur as he stepped inside, his gun lowered now, his training fighting with the urge to drop everything and just reach for his child. When Dominic's small body launched forward, when his arms wrapped around Chance's neck with a desperation that spoke of every hour of terror that had passed in this room, every second of wondering whether he had been forgotten, Chance finally let himself break. Tears he had refused to shed for lost comrades, for shattered missions, for the slow erosion of his marriage, filled freely now as he folded his son against his chest. The sensation was almost unbearable. Dominic's heartbeat pounding like a captive bird against him, the boy's breath hot and shaky against his collar, his small fingers clutching at the fabric of his shirt as if he had no intention of ever letting go again. Chance pressed his face briefly into Dominic's hair and breathed in the scent of him. Something pure and familiar under the dust and fear, a mix of baby shampoo and whatever faint trace of home still clung to the boy. For a moment, the world outside that embrace ceased to exist. There were no kidnappers, no ex-wives, no legal nightmares waiting outside. There was only a father and a son, reunited in the least sacred place imaginable, somehow creating something holy in spite of it. It was Mariah's eyes that pulled him back to the rest of the scene. Bound to a chair in the corner, wrists raw where the ropes bit into her skin, she looked nothing like the villain the preliminary reports had painted. Her face was ashen, streaked with tears that had dried and started again so many times they had etched pale lines down her cheeks. Her shoulders shook not with panic for herself but with a deeper, more complicated grief that had been building long before this night. She had carried Dominic once before, in a far different context, when his life was just a possibility growing inside her. She had felt his kicks under her ribcage, heard his heartbeat on monitors that made her own heart stutter. That bond had never vanished, even when legal documents and family agreements had told her to step aside. Seeing Dominic pressed so tightly against his father now, clinging to Chance as if he were the only safe harbor in a storm, Mariah felt a mix of relief and devastation so intense she almost couldn't breathe. Relief, because the boy was alive, because he was back in the arms of someone who would die before letting him be hurt again. Devastation, because that image also underlined just how far she had fallen, how deeply she had betrayed the trust that had once made her part of a strange, cobbled-together family. She had wanted to rescue Dominic from what she saw as emotional neglect, from being passed around as a symbol between adults more focused on their own wounds than on his needs. But now, watching the way he melted against his father, she had to confront the ugly possibility that she had simply reenacted her own trauma with him, dragging him into her unresolved pain about belonging and abandonment. Ian's ideology had made it easier to justify each step, telling her that traditional structures were corrupt, that only radical action could protect the innocent, that the law served the powerful and would always side against someone like her. In this room, with that man cuffed and stripped of his pseudo-prophetic aura, those justifications rang hollow. Mariah saw herself as the world would soon see her, a woman who had taken a child from his home, who had aligned herself with a known manipulator, who had allowed fear and resentment to override the very maternal instincts she claimed to honor. Chance's gaze moved from his son to Mariah, and the shift felt physical, like the temperature in the room plummeting. His eyes, red-rimmed from tears, hardened with a resolve that had nothing to do with personal vengeance and everything to do with the badge he wore and those he had taken. He had once trusted this woman. He had once believed that her love for his son, though unconventional, though complicated by history, would be a safeguard, not a threat. Now he had to reconcile the memory of the woman who had sung lullabies to Dominic when Abby was too exhausted to stand, with the reality of the person tied up in front of him, complicit in a plot that could have ended with his child gone forever. Yet even as anger pulsed through him, Chance was not blind to the nuance in her eyes. There was terror there, yes, at what awaited her once they stepped outside this room: police cruisers, steel bars, lawyers, a town ready to condemn. But there was also something more fragile, something that looked painfully like love. She watched Dominic as if trying to memorize the exact way his shoulders rose and fell, the way his small hand curled in the fabric of his father's shirt, as if she knew that this might be the last time she saw him outside of supervised visitation, if she saw him again at all. Chance understood the law. He understood what the charges would look like: kidnapping, conspiracy, child endangerment. He also understood that Mariah's motivations would not erase those crimes. But he could not entirely silence the empathy that came from knowing how trauma could distort a person's sense of right and wrong. He had seen it in war zones, in undercover operations, in back alleys where broken people clung to broken logic to justify unforgivable things. The difference here was that the damage had reached into his own home, his own bloodline. The biggest question, however, was not what he would do with Ian or even with Mariah. The system had protocols for people like them, even if the emotional cost would ripple for years. The question that loomed before him like a dark ocean was what to do about Abby. Somewhere in Genoa City, Abby was likely pacing, calling hospitals, screaming at officers who could offer too little comfort, living the nightmare that every parent dreaded. She and Chance had already been shattered by his past choices, their marriage eroded by absence and miscommunication, and the weight of things left unsaid. When they finally separated, it had not been with hatred but with a kind of exhausted resignation, as if they had both run out of ways to love each other without breaking themselves. In the wake of that rupture, custody and co-parenting had always been fragile topics, handled through attorneys and careful schedules. Now, holding Dominic, feeling the boy's aching relief as he pressed closer, Chance realized he stood on the threshold of another potentially devastating decision. The law and basic morality were clear. The child's mother had a right to know he was safe. From a legal standpoint, withholding that information, even briefly, would be unthinkable. But the wounded part of him, the part that remembered Abby's pain-etched face when he chose duty over domestic stability, whispered ugly questions. Did she still deserve to be the first to hold Dominic after this ordeal, when she had moved on in ways that made him feel replaceable? Did she understand the kind of danger their son had been in, or would she frame this entire nightmare as another failure on his part, another proof that Chance's involvement only brought chaos? He hated himself for even thinking it, but the thoughts came anyway, creeping in along the edges of his training and his ethics. If he took Dominic somewhere quiet first, somewhere safe and hidden. If he held his son a little longer before inviting the rest of the world back into the boy's life, would that be so unforgivable? Could he justify a small delay as a way to shield Dominic from the immediate circus that would erupt the moment the news broke? Flashing lights, reporters, lawyers, accusations flying between families who had already weaponized the child's existence. He could imagine Abby's reaction in vivid detail, the way her shoulders would sag in relieved sobs when she saw Dominic, the way her expression would shift when she realized Chance was the one who had brought him back, the stew of gratitude and resentment that would follow. He could also imagine her discovering that he had hesitated to call her right away, that for some span of minutes or hours, he had chosen to keep this reunion exclusively his. In that version of the story, he became the villain yet again, not the rescuer. He had to admit, too, that part of him wanted to confront her with the raw reality of what had just unfolded before any lawyer could soften it, before anyone could spin it. He wanted her to see Ian in handcuffs, to see Mariah's tear-streaked face, to understand that the people she had trusted to be close to their son had failed him profoundly. Dominic shifted in his arms, whimpering softly as the adrenaline of the reunion began to drop, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion of a traumatized child. Chance adjusted his grip, one hand supporting the boy's back, the other cradling his head with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the earlier violence in the corridor. The boy's breathing began to match his, rising and falling in a fragile rhythm that tethered them to each other. Behind him, Ian muttered something into the gag that no one bothered to interpret. Mariah closed her eyes briefly, as if listening for a verdict that would determine the shape of the rest of her life. Chance knew that once he stepped outside with Dominic, this moment would be gone forever, folded into police reports, media narratives, courtroom testimonies. This room, with its peeling paint and bad lighting, would become a crime scene in the official record, but for him it would always be something more complicated. The place where he became a father again in a way he had never allowed himself to fully be before, and the place where he realized just how much damage had grown in the void of his absence. He shifted Dominic slightly to free one hand and reached for his phone, feeling the slick weight of it against his palm. The screen lit up, a sterile glow in the dim room, and Abby's name hovered at the top of his recent calls like a question he had been dodging for months. It would take only a second to press the icon, to hear her voice crackle through the speaker, to hear the raw sound she would make when he told her their son was alive and in his arms. It would also open the floodgates. Squad cars would swarm the property, higher-ups would take over the case, lawyers would begin crafting statements, and in all of that noise, the quiet truth of what had happened here, of how close they had all come to losing Dominic forever, might be drowned out. Chance stood there for a heartbeat that felt impossibly long, with his son pressed against him, his ex-wife's name glowing in his hand, and two prisoners watching the scales tip. One was a cultish manipulator who believed he had outsmarted a system he despised. The other was a woman who had let her love be twisted into something dangerously possessive. Both would bear the weight of what the law decided they deserved, but the choice that hung over them all in that instant did not belong to any judge or jury. It belonged solely to Chance, whether he would be the man who followed every rule no matter how much it hurt, or the man who, just this once, allowed his heart to override the training that had defined his entire life. As the phone vibrated softly in his grip, a new notification flashing at the top of the screen. The future of Dominic's fractured family balanced on whether his thumb would move the last few millimeters and make the call, or whether, for reasons he might not be able to justify even to himself, he would slide the phone back into his pocket and step out into the night with his son, leaving Abby and the rest of Genoa City in the dark for just a little longer.